Joining us right now is Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, who's been such an important voice during the past few weeks having to do with COVID-19 coronavirus. By the way, before we even get started, you've got to read his book. You've got some time on your hands. You should read some good books at this time. Sacred Duty, A Soldier's Tour at Arlington National Cemetery is a great book for you to read, and it's a great Father's Day or Mother's Day gift. Why don't you just take care of that now? Senator Cotton, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Larry. It's good to be on with you.
There's so much I want to ask you about. Let's start here at home, or most specifically in your home in the state of Arkansas. I don't have to tell you, Senator Cotton, that Arkansas is a lot different than Manhattan. When you hear from the people of Arkansas and you see this sort of one-size-fits-all reaction from the federal government and what the media seems to be demanding, is there a disconnect, and are we in danger of alienating people who are in rural or suburban areas that aren't quite dealing with this in the same way that people in densely populated areas must?
Well, Larry, you're right that one size doesn't fit all in our very diverse continental nation. And what's right in New York City right now at the peak of their crisis is not right in Kansas City, and it's certainly not right in Star City, Arkansas. But our governor has taken prudent steps in terms of encouraging social distancing, time to keep kids from spreading it at schools and then bring it back home. And then what we've seen everywhere in terms of closures of restaurants and bars, movie theaters, and so forth. I think what you'll really see in terms of the difference between the various parts of the country is when we begin to get past the peak of the crisis, we get people back to work, and we get the economy back on its feet. That's when we really and truly will need a calibrated, gradual rolling effort on not just a state-by-state basis, but community-by-community basis. It's important to remember that President Trump didn't shut anything down. The president doesn't have that power in our federal system. That's the governors and mayors.
Thank God for that, by the way.
Yeah. Now, I would say, too, that to be honest with you, a lot of these governors and mayors didn't really even shut things down. It was the legitimate fears of millions of Americans of a highly contagious and pretty dangerous virus that was causing revenues to fall off the cliffs at places like movie theaters and restaurants. But as our governors and mayors get to or get on the other side of the peak of this crisis, whether it's happening now in New York or happens in late April or early May in Little Rock, they'll make the decisions based on local conditions with federal guidance. And that's really the way it should be, because one size truly will not fit all in our country.
Senator Cotton, how at the time when this first started to spread and the president started doing the daily briefings, I understood our policy that the tests for coronavirus was really only useful for people who had significant symptoms and fell into certain danger groups. But at this point now, how important will testing be to sort of flatten this curve and really sort of get us back to that point of normalcy and getting past this?
Testing will really be vital in the days and the weeks ahead. There's several steps we'll need to get to back to something like normal. One, we'll need testing capacity that is quick and that is widespread. So, if you go to the doctor and you get tested for the flu, take a swab of your nose and you get the results in 5 to 10 minutes. We are getting there with the coronavirus as well. In many cases, Larry, it's not really a limitation in terms of the science or knowledge. It's a limitation on production capacity, making the swabs, making the chemical reagents, having the testing platforms. But there are some companies I know that are working on developing tests that can even be done at home, much like a pregnancy test can be done. That is a really vital part of getting back to something like normal. A second part are the antibody tests that are being developed now as well. So we can have a sense of just how widespread the virus has been for all those people who were never symptomatic at all. They had the disease, they may have spread the disease, but they themselves never showed any symptoms whatsoever. So now they have antibodies. They may play an important role in terms of getting our economy back on its feet and getting people back to work. And then, of course, you got to decide what to do with people who test positive. That's why we'll need to have proactive, aggressive quarantine measures, and then trace contacts of people who are testing positive so we can identify, much like South Korea has done, on a case-by-case basis where the risk is, because that's what we ultimately want to get to. We're using population-based measures now. We want to get to case-based measures as quickly as possible so everyone can get back to something like normal.
And for those who don't know, Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas literally was one of the very first voices in this country sounding the alarm about, at the time, what was described as a mysterious pneumonia-like illness in Wuhan. Senator Cotton, I heard you on my friend Hugh Hewitt's radio show, national show, talking about this. I saw you tweeting about this for a while. When you approached the administration in late January and early February about this, how much of the policy of this government was fueled by or informed by the World Health Organization, who we now know was absolutely compromised by the propaganda side of Beijing?
Well, it won't surprise you or many of your listeners to know that Donald Trump doesn't give a lot of credence to international bureaucrats. So in my conversations with the president and senior cabinet officials, senior White House aides, what I found was an understandable tension between taking preventative public health measures before there appeared to be a serious threat on the one hand, and on the other hand, the economic impact shutting down travel with China could have had, since they're one of our largest trading partners. Now, in retrospect, that seems quaint to think about the economic impact of merely shutting travel with China, but it was a serious concern on the president's mind, as it is now. We not only have to arrest the spread of this virus, but we do have to ultimately get people back to work, get the economy back on its feet. So in my experience in January, the president was trying to balance those considerations. And over the week or so in which I consulted with administration officials and spoke with him, as the virus spread more aggressively through China, he came to realize that the economic impact was probably inevitable to a degree, and that what we needed to do was buy ourselves time to mitigate the public health impact. And hard as it is to believe, I think the president's decision did just that. We would be in a much worse position today than we would have been if air travel had continued in China for even a week more.
Yeah. And so given that and given what we know, I don't think there's, everyone's saying, oh, we shouldn't look back, we shouldn't second guess. I think it's very, you'll never learn and you don't gain wisdom by not looking back and seeing what happened. Is it fair to say that there are thousands of people worldwide, and sadly there will be thousands of Americans dead today because of the actions of the Chinese Communist government, the inaction of the Chinese government, and the lies of the Chinese government?
Absolutely. The Chinese Communist Party is responsible for unleashing a global pandemic on the world. Their lies and their corruption turned what could have been a local health problem in Wuhan into a global pandemic. And the civilized world ought to view China as a pariah state.
Well, and of course, there's no evidence that this was done deliberately by the communist government in Beijing, but the lies certainly were deliberate. The withholding of information and lack of transparency and not working with us, that's deliberate. That's a deliberate act. Shouldn't something be done? It
was entirely deliberate going back to early December. We now know that these cases must have originated no later than mid to late November, since the first symptoms began to manifest in early December. And it was pretty clear from the earliest days in December to the Chinese Communist Party that this was a novel coronavirus related to the SARS coronavirus that we saw in 2002 and 2003 that was also a deadly epidemic. Rather than tell their people what had happened, take the proper preventative measures, report it to the WHO, even ask for help from countries like America or European nations and other leading industrial powers, the Chinese Communist Party covered it up. They let millions of people fly out of China as this virus spread. They let tens of thousands of people fly out of Wuhan directly into our major cities. They are responsible for the economic catastrophe and for the lives lost and harmed because of this virus.
Senator Tom Cotton is our guest from Arkansas, and listen, you were actually skeptical and cautious with regard to the extent of our trade relationship with China before the Wuhan virus. Now, given the conditions that the entire world is suffering under, when we get through this, do we need to rethink our trade, our business relationship with countries that take on the kind of policies and refuse to adhere to basic hygiene with their wet markets and things like this, before we continue to allow our corporations to put our citizens in harm's way? I mean, that I know it seems stark to put it that way, but can't we make demands on the nations that we do business with to make sure that they live up to basic standards, basic health standards, so that we can protect our own people?
To my mind, the rethinking is already done. The time for action is fast approaching. China has to be held accountable for what it's done to the world, and we can never allow ourselves to be dependent again on the Chinese Communist Party, an adversarial dictatorial nation, for basic pharmaceutical products like antibiotics, penicillin, acetaminophen, ibuprofen, to say nothing of dozens of pharmaceutical ingredients. If you are anywhere on the manufacturing value chain above cheap plastic toys or lawn chairs, I suggest you start developing contingency plans to pack up your stuff and get out of China. If you do it on your terms, otherwise you can do it on our terms in the Congress.
Senator Cotton, when you hear the president was somewhat supportive of President Xi, and I certainly don't want to drag you into a dispute with the administration at this time. However, would it serve our response right now in rallying the world to this message, Senator Cotton, to start using the bully pulpit to call them out a little bit more harshly?
So, Larry, a couple points on that. The president, as the president, obviously has to maintain a working relationship with other national leaders around the world, to include China, which is a very powerful and important country in the world. So he can't simply cut off all communications with Chairman Xi. But second, unfortunately, as I said, we are dependent right now in large part on China for many of our basic pharmaceutical products and medical devices. That dependency is not going to change in the near run. It should change in a matter of months, but at the peak of this crisis, we'll have to continue to work with the Chinese Communist Party to ensure that our great doctors and nurses and their patients and our hospitals have the equipment and the pharmaceutical products they need to get us through this crisis. Right, that's the dependency, though, that has to end.
Yeah, that's fair enough, and I don't disagree. Let me drag you into a dispute maybe that you will welcome. There was a long time, in fact, there's still members of the American media enjoying their First Amendment rights, and thank God they've got those First Amendment rights. But they are literally parroting the propaganda coming out of the Communist Party in Beijing, from small things like saying it's racist to say that the virus originated in China, all the way up to quoting their death toll numbers as if they should be legitimately measured against the free nation's death toll numbers. Is it time for the American media to be a little more circumspect about how they're covering this story?
Too much of our mainstream media simply acts as a mouthpiece for Chinese communist propaganda. And in some cases, they do it knowingly and for profit. Look at the Washington Post and the New York Times. They repeatedly run inserts that are written and paid for by the Chinese Communist Party that they purport to be news when they're really nothing but propaganda, all so they can pad their bottom lines. At the very same time that the Chinese Communist Party has kicked reporters out of China from the Washington Post and the New York Times. It is time for our media to start treating China like what it is, a pariah state and an adversary.
Finally, Senator Cotton, back to the CARES Act, a $2.2 trillion relief bill that you, along with every single one of your fellow senators, voted for. It's being implemented now. Americans who are feeling the heat on this and feeling real economic pain will be getting some relief. But we already hear House Speaker Nancy Pelosi talking about yet another bill, and she's suggesting that it should have some progressive Green New Deal type provisions within it. Is now the time to legislate ideas like that? Do you even think there's a need for another bill at this point?
Yeah, the reason why Nancy Pelosi is a little grumpy these days and wants a new bill is that she couldn't get any of those left-wing wish list items into the last bill, the CARES Act. I think what we should do is focus on getting that bill implemented, getting the cash payments that will give needed relief to distressed families out the door and in their hands, and helping our businesses keep their workers connected to the business, keep them on the payroll so they can get back on their feet and go back to work when this pandemic is behind us. Now, if more money is necessary to support those families and support those businesses, I suspect Congress will act. But what we will not do, what we refused to do last time, is to allow Nancy Pelosi to exploit a crisis to pass extraneous measures like the Green New Deal.
It's a bait and switch. I do have one last question for you now, Senator Cotton, because that was so good. Adam Schiff announced yesterday that he would like to have a select committee to investigate the Trump administration's response to COVID-19 coronavirus. I don't disagree that we should ask questions and examine how we responded so we can get better. However, you were there during the impeachment trials. As chairman of the Intelligence Committee in the House, didn't Adam Schiff himself have a role to play in this? As this story was spreading, did he fulfill his duties as chairman of the House Intelligence Committee in ensuring that our CIA Intelligence Committee were getting facts from China instead of propaganda?
Yeah, there's little doubt that the partisan impeachment trial that paralyzed the Senate for January and early February prevented a lot of members of Congress from looking more carefully into this growing crisis and taking action. And I suspect you'd put right at the top of that list the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee and the lead impeachment manager, Adam Schiff.
Well, one member of Congress was not asleep at the switch on this. Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, literally one of the first voice, if not the first voice as an elected official, sounding the alarm about COVID-19 coronavirus. Thank you for being on that wall, and I appreciate you joining us today.
Thank you, Larry.
Again, Senator Cotton's book is Sacred Duty, A Soldier's Tour at Arlington National Cemetery, and it's a great one. Get it, read it, and give it as a gift.
This